how do housing markets and individual housing careers interact with social, economic and demographic transformations? And I'm interested in this in different societies, particularly in Europe and East Asia. Housing has become increasingly commodified in recent decades. Families have become increasingly orientated around housing markets as a means to accumulate assets, not just live somewhere. And they're using these assets with a view to supplement their pension and security in later life, or even to pass on to their children. What's contradictory to traditional social science perspectives is that housing has been traditionally looked on as a good, as the outcome of economic forces. And it's becoming clearer that there's a lot more to it than that. My research is concerned with these questions about how housing markets in each country or city makes individuals and the system itself more exposed to fluctuations in the global market. I have a particularly comparative interest, and I've done lots of work on East Asia. And my concern with East Asia is that there is a particular orientation in these countries around building home ownership, around supporting private housing consumption as a means to support high-speed economic growth, as well as support the family as a basis of welfare. In recent years, however, these high-speed economies have begun to slow down. At the same time, these societies have begun to age, and we see increasing fragmentation in terms of family formation and movement through housing and family careers. In this context, how is that affecting the function of housing goods and housing markets as a means to sustain or supplement the welfare system? Our research has identified a particular set of characteristics associated with housing and welfare regimes in East Asia. And in that has been a particular orientation around subsidizing private housing consumption, but mediated through the provision of very large public agencies that help people buy their home. What's happened though, as high-speed growth has waned and the economy has become more vulnerable, is that a generational divide has begun to emerge. On the one hand, you have the baby boomers who could buy houses when they were relatively cheap and experienced really high increases in the value of their assets. But younger people are finding it increasingly hard to get on the housing ladder. Some even struggle to get secure employment. What we see in countries like South Korea and Japan is increasing numbers of younger people staying longer in their parents' homes, often until their 40s. At the same time, we see increasing demand not for home ownership, but for rental housing, especially small units for single people, because there's such a strong alignment between moving through a housing career and moving through a family career. For older people, the problems emerging are to do with sustaining house price increases indefinitely. In recent years, as the economy has become slower and there's increasing numbers of older people with housing assets, they've depended more and more on these assets for their security in later life. However, these economies have become more vulnerable to economic fluctuations and booms and busts in the housing market, making their housing assets more vulnerable for use as a welfare good, for tapping into in later life. What's particularly interesting is that from a European perspective, while housing systems and housing markets are very different, we see an increasing tendency for people to look at housing in this way, and for governments to orientate housing policy around the idea that people use housing as a pension in later life. And we also see these intergenerational gaps and divides emerging, especially in societies where housing wealth is particularly important for pensions and security in old age. What is also interesting is that in Europe, even though housing markets and housing systems are quite different, we're beginning to see similar patterns emerging in terms of generational divides, with it becoming increasingly difficult for younger people to move into home ownership. We see this especially in countries like the UK, where there's a stronger tie between buying a house and accumulating housing assets over the life course and security in old age.